They never tell you that the fortress hums. Not the mechanical hum of imperial machinery, blessed and understood, but something else, something that resonates in your bones before you hear it, that makes your teeth ache and your vision blur at the edges. I've worked maintenance detail on Blackstone Station Tertius for 11 years now, and the hum has never stopped, never varied in pitch or intensity, never given any indication that it might be mechanical at all. It simply exists, constant as the Emperor's gaze, pervasive as the void beyond our recycled atmosphere. The tech priests tell us it's harmonics from the power distribution systems, that Blackstone material conducts energy in ways standard imperial architecture doesn't, that our discomfort is merely human weakness confronting superior engineering. But I've seen the tech priests themselves flinch when the hum spikes during certain maintenance cycles, seen them trace the sign of the cog with trembling mechadendrites, and I know they're lying. We're all lying to ourselves about what this place is, what it does, what it's doing to us. I came to the fortress as an engineering apprentice, fresh from the Shola Progenium on a shrine world whose name I can no longer quite remember, not because time has eroded the memory, but because something about Tertius makes memories of elsewhere feel thin, unreal, like dreams you can't quite grasp upon waking. I was 18 years old and believed absolutely in the Emperor's protection, in the righteousness of imperial service, in the grandeur of manning one of humanity's greatest weapons against the darkness. The Blackstone fortresses were legend, ancient structures of unknown origin claimed by the Imperium and sanctified through faith and blood, capable of destroying worlds or shielding entire systems depending on their configuration. To serve aboard one was honor beyond measure, or so I'd been taught. The transport that brought me here took 6 weeks, threading through the warp with Geller fields straining against pressures that made the crew pray constantly in the lower decks. When we finally translated into real space, and I saw Tertius through the viewport of vast geometric impossibility hanging against the stars, all dark angles and surfaces that seemed to reject light rather than reflect it, I felt something I'd been trained to recognize as awe, but which I now understand was warning, my body trying to tell me to run while running was still possible. The station is enormous in ways that defy human comprehension. The Administratum classifications list it as 40 kilometers along its longest axis. But those measurements feel meaningless when you're walking the corridors, when you can travel for hours through passages that seem to bend in directions geometry shouldn't allow, when you take a documented route to a documented location and somehow arrive 3 hours later than transit time should permit. There are sections where the architecture makes sense. Imperial modifications, hab quarters and command centers and munitions storage, all standard template construction bolted onto the ancient substrate like barnacles on a whale. But between these islands of comprehensibility stretches the fortress itself. Blackstone passages carved or grown or manifested through some process no one understands. Walls that are perfectly smooth and slightly warm to the touch. Floors that never accumulate dust no matter how long they're untraversed. Ceilings that vanish into darkness even when you shine lumens upward. My first assignment was in Sector 47 Gamma, a maintenance depot responsible for managing the life support distribution nodes in the outer residential rings. Standard work, they told me. Simple work, nothing to fear. The crew I joined had been working Sector 47 Gamma for an average of 7 years. There were 12 of us, a senior engineer named Valdris, who'd been on the fortress for 16 years, 9 technicians of varying experience, and 2 servitors, whose previous identities had been efficiently erased by lobotomy and augmentation. We worked 8-hour shifts maintaining the atmospheric recyclers, checking pressure seals, replacing components in the water reclamation systems, all the tedious necessities that keep 30,000 crew members breathing and hydrated. The work was straightforward, the kind of repetitive technical labor I'd been trained for, and for the first few weeks I found comfort in routine, in the familiar rituals of imperial engineering. But slowly, gradually, I began to notice things. The tools we'd leave in one location would appear in another, always somewhere logical but not where we'd placed them. The corridors we traveled daily would sometimes require an extra turn, an additional intersection that hadn't existed the day before but which everyone remembered as if it had always been there. And always, constantly, that hummed deeper in these older sections, resonating through the Blackstone itself, making the fillings in my teeth vibrate and my dreams strange. Valdris noticed me noticing. He was a lean man with augmetic eyes that glowed faintly green in low light, his hands more metal than flesh after decades of engineering work and inevitable accidents. He pulled me aside during a meal break, led me to a small observation alcove where you could see out into the void through an armor-glass viewport, and he spoke to me in a voice carefully pitched below the hum's frequency. "You're starting to feel it," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The fortress. It's aware of us. Not conscious, maybe, or conscious in ways that don't translate to human understanding, but aware, responsive. It shifts itself, rearranges, never dramatically, never enough that anyone can prove it's happening, but consistently, constantly, like an organism accommodating parasites." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as superstition or fatigue-induced paranoia, but I couldn't because I knew he was right, had known it since my first week, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge the knowledge. "Does Command know?" I asked. Valdris smiled without humor. "Command has been here longer than anyone. They know better than we do. But what are they going to do? Report to the Administratum that their fortress weapon exhibits autonomous spatial reconfiguration? Request withdrawal from a strategic asset humanity can barely comprehend but desperately needs? No. They'll do what we all do. They'll adapt. They'll endure. They'll serve until the fortress decides otherwise. The nightmares started in my 3rd month. Nothing dramatic, just unsettling. I'd dream I was walking the maintenance corridors, performing routine checks, except the corridors would extend forever, stretching into infinity, and I'd walk for hours, days, years, still completing my inspections, still checking pressure valves and atmospheric filters, never stopping, never finished, never permitted to rest. I'd wake gasping, my quarters suddenly feeling too small, the walls too close, and I'd realize I was clutching my tool harness like a talisman. Others had similar dreams. We'd compare them sometimes during meals in the communal mess, speaking carefully, using euphemisms, never quite admitting what we were describing. "Strange sleep last night," someone would say. "Yeah, me too," another would respond. And we'd exchange looks that communicated volumes our mouths wouldn't form. The Medicaid staff distributed sedatives freely, and most of us took them, trading uneasy dreams for chemically enforced oblivion, never questioning why sedative usage on Blackstone stations was triple the Imperial Guard average. In my 6th month, I discovered the archives, or rather, the archives revealed themselves to me. I took a wrong turn, returning from a repair job in the outer hull sections, found myself in a corridor I didn't recognize, followed it because going back felt somehow wrong, and emerged into a vast chamber filled with data stacks and document storage units. All standard Administratum issue but coated in dust that suggested decades of neglect. The lighting was minimal, emergency lumens only, casting everything in dim red that made the shadows seem to move when I turned my head. I should have reported this, should have logged the location and requested proper archival teams, but something made me investigate instead, made me pull up files on the nearest cogitator terminal and begin reading. The records were personnel files, thousands of them, dating back to when the Imperium first claimed this fortress centuries ago. I started reading randomly, skimming entries, and a pattern emerged that made my throat tighten. Average service duration, 4.3 years. Cause of separation from service, 93% psychological unsuitability. 6% disappeared during routine duties. 1% other. There were no retirement records, no transfers to other postings, no long-term survivors beyond a handful of command staff who seemed to rotate positions without ever leaving. We weren't serving on this fortress. We were being consumed by it, processed at a rate carefully calibrated to maintain operational capacity while ensuring no one served long enough to fully understand what was happening. I should have reported what I found. I should have requested immediate transfer, claimed psychological distress, anything to escape. Instead, I returned to my duties, returned to checking atmospheric processors and replacing worn gaskets and cleaning coolant filters. Because what else was there? The fortress was months away from any significant Imperial presence, isolated by design so its weapons couldn't be easily sabotaged or captured. Requesting emergency evacuation would require justification, evidence, proof, and what proof did I have? Personnel records showing high psychological discharge rates. That could be explained by the stress of isolated posting. Feelings of spatial disorientation? Clearly my own inadequacy adapting to unique architecture. Dreams of endless corridors? Sign I needed increased sedative dosage. The system was perfect, self-sealing, designed not through conspiracy but through the simple logic of institutional inertia. Blackstone Fortress was strategically vital. Therefore, concerns about it must be overreaction. Therefore, those raising concerns were mentally unstable. Therefore, the high rate of psychological discharge was evidence the screening process was working correctly. Therefore, everything was fine. Therefore, Valdris disappeared in my 8th month. He went to inspect a coolant junction in Sector 52 Delta and never returned. Search teams found nothing, no body, no signs of struggle, no equipment malfunction, no evidence he'd ever been there beyond the logged entry in the duty roster. Command listed him as missing, presumed lost to structural accident, issued standard condolences to his non-existent family. The file claimed he had a wife and 2 children on a civilized world he'd never mentioned in 4 years of working together, and assigned his duties to the rest of Conda. Us. His quarters were cleared and reassigned within a day. His tools were redistributed. His name appeared on the casualty lists posted in the main assembly halls, 1 entry among hundreds, and then he was forgotten. But I remembered. How he'd talked about the fortress being aware, about it accommodating us like an organism tolerating parasites, and I wondered if the fortress had decided he understood too much, had paid too close attention, had needed to be removed. This thought should have been insane, should have been evidence of my own deteriorating mental state, but it felt right, felt true with a certainty I couldn't explain or deny. The isolation intensified after Valdris vanished. Not physical isolation. I worked alongside the same crew, ate in the same mess halls, slept in the same hab blocks, but emotional, psychological. We stopped making eye contact during duty shifts. We stopped the carefully euphemistic conversations about our dreams. We performed our tasks with mechanical efficiency, speaking only when technical coordination required it. Existing beside each other, without connection. This was adaptation, I realized. This was survival. Forming attachments to people who might disappear without explanation was dangerous, painful, exhausting. Better to reduce everyone to function, to title and role, to treat your companions as you'd treat servitors, necessary components of the work process, nothing more. I watched myself becoming this. Watched the person I'd been erode like metal, under constant abrasion. And I couldn't stop it because stopping would require caring, and caring hurt too much in a place where people simply ceased to exist. The hum changed in my 9th month. Not dramatically, it remained the same constant presence it had always been, but I began to hear patterns in it, rhythms that felt almost like communication, like speech in a frequency just below human comprehension. I'd be working on a pressure valve and suddenly understand that I needed to check a filter 3 sections away, not because of any logical diagnostic process, but because the hum told me, and I'd go and find the filter 90% clogged. Crisis averted. Other technicians experienced this too, I realized, watching them work. They'd pause mid-task, heads tilted as if listening to something inaudible, then move with sudden purpose to address problems before monitoring systems even registered them. We were becoming attuned to the fortress, learning to interpret its signals, evolving into more effective maintenance organisms. Command praised our efficiency, our seemingly precognitive ability to prevent malfunctions. They didn't ask how we knew. They didn't want to know. Results were what mattered, and we were producing results, keeping the fortress operational at higher efficiency than any previous crew rotation. We were becoming exactly what the fortress needed us to be. I started exploring during my off shifts, mapping corridors that weren't on any official schematics, documenting spaces that shouldn't exist within the fortress's documented dimensions. I'd enter a maintenance tunnel and emerge in what appeared to be an ancient observation deck, all sweeping curves and surfaces that seemed to show the void beyond without any visible viewport, stars swimming in the walls themselves like luminescent fish in dark water. I'd find chambers filled with geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, that left after images in colors I had no names for. I'd discover rooms that were perfect spheres, impossible to construct through any known method, their surfaces covered in markings that might have been writing or decoration or circuit patterns, glowing faintly with their own light. None of this was documented. None of this appeared on the fortress schematics. When I tried to bring others to these locations, the paths would be different, the rooms gone or changed, and my companions would look at me with concern that suggested my psychological discharge paperwork was being prepared. I stopped reporting my findings. I stopped trying to share what I'd discovered. I simply explored, documenting everything in a personal journal I kept hidden in a gap behind the wall panel in my quarters, writing in a cipher I'd invented, because I knew surveillance monitored all digital communications and random inspections checked physical documents. The journal grew thick with descriptions of impossible architecture, with maps of corridors that shifted, with observations about the hum and the dreams and the way people vanished. I wrote about how the fortress seemed to be selecting which crew members disappeared, taking those who adapted too slowly or understood too quickly, maintaining a population of workers who were functional but not troublesome, useful but not aware. I wrote about how this selection process might have been operating for centuries, how the fortress might be breeding humanity for compatibility, choosing traits through brutal Darwinian pressure applied over generations of crew rotation. I wrote about how I might be scheduled for removal, how keeping this journal was probably evidence I'd crossed whatever threshold the fortress applied to determine problematic awareness. I wrote, knowing I might disappear before I could share any of this, writing anyway, because documentation felt like resistance, like proof that I'd existed, that I'd noticed, that I'd refused to simply accept what was happening. My first full year on Tertius ended without ceremony. Command issued standard service recognition certificates, thin polymer sheets stamped with the administratum seal and my name and service duration, meaningless bureaucratic acknowledgement of sustained existence. 7 members of my original crew were gone by then, replaced by new arrivals who looked exactly as I'd looked 12 months earlier, young, faithful, eager to serve, completely unprepared for what they'd encounter. I watched them arrive, watched them begin the same progression I'd experienced, and I said nothing. What could I say? That the fortress was alive in ways that violated everything we believed about reality? That they'd lose themselves slowly, their identities eroded by constant exposure to architecture that shouldn't exist? That they'd probably be gone within 5 years, discharged for psychological instability, or simply vanished into the fortress's infinite corridors? They wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me. And even if they did believe, what difference would it make? We were all trapped here, all serving our time, all waiting to discover if we'd be among the 6% who disappeared or the 93% who broke. The tech priests started avoiding me around my 15th month. Not obviously, they still responded to maintenance requests, still provided the necessary blessings for machine spirits, still performed their duties with appropriate ritual, but something in their body language changed when I was present. A subtle tension, a careful distance. I realized eventually that they could see what was happening to me, could detect whatever changes the fortress worked on its long-term inhabitants, and they were disturbed by it. The tech priests worshipped the machine god, believed in the sanctity of technology, but the Blackstone Fortresses predated humanity's technical understanding, operated on principles the Mechanicus couldn't explain or replicate. They were holy because they were useful, sanctified through necessity rather than comprehension, and that made them troubling, wrong, acceptable only through compartmentalization and deliberate ignorance. And I was becoming a reminder of that wrongness, a demonstration that the fortress changed people in ways blessed machinery shouldn't, that the line between tool and entity was less clear than doctrine claimed. I began to see the others who'd served too long, There weren't many, perhaps 20 individuals scattered across a crew of 30,000, invisible to casual observation but recognizable once you knew what to look for. They moved differently, with a fluid precision that seemed choreographed, always taking the most efficient path through crowds, never colliding, never hesitating. Their eyes had a particular quality, a depth or distance that suggested they were seeing more than normal human vision should perceive. They maintained their duties perfectly, never making mistakes, never requiring supervision, working with an almost mechanical consistency that made servitors seem clumsy by comparison. Command loved them, promoted them to positions of minor authority, used them as examples of dedicated service. No one seemed to notice that they never spoke unless spoken to, never socialized, never displayed any emotion beyond what was contextually appropriate. They were becoming something else, something between human and whatever the fortress was, and I was joining them. The dreams changed in my 18th month. Instead of walking endless corridors, I began to dream I was the fortress itself, vast and ancient, floating in the void, feeling the tiny organisms crawling through my passages, like a human might feel bacteria on their skin. The dreams weren't unpleasant. There was a strange peace in being something so large, so permanent, so indifferent to individual existence. I could feel the weapons systems charging and discharging, the power flowing through me in patterns that created defensive fields or death beams depending on configuration. I could sense the void around me, the stars, the warp's distant pressure. All of it filtered through senses that weren't sight or hearing, but something more fundamental, and I could feel the crew. 30,000 sparks of consciousness, some bright and frantic, some dim and fading, all temporary, all necessary, all ultimately insignificant, except in their collective function. I'd wake from these dreams feeling calm, centered, understanding, and the understanding horrified me because it felt right, felt true, felt like I was finally seeing clearly after years of inadequate perception. I tried to resist. I forced myself to maintain routines that felt human. I'd eat meals even when I wasn't hungry, sleep on schedule even when I no longer felt fatigue, engage in small talk with newer crew members even when their concerns seemed trivial and temporary. But resistance was exhausting, was swimming against a current that never relented, and gradually my efforts weakened, my humanity eroded, my sense of self diffused into something larger and less defined. I stopped keeping the journal. It seemed pointless, seemed like clinging to identity that was already gone. I stopped exploring. I already knew all the fortress's spaces, knew them instinctively, could navigate without thinking because I was part of the fortress's awareness now, part of its distributed consciousness. I stopped sleeping in my quarters, finding it more natural to simply rest wherever my duties ended, standing motionless in maintenance corridors like the servitors did, conserving energy, waiting for the next task. Command noticed, of course. I was brought before a senior administrator in my 22nd month, a stern woman with administratum tattoos covering her shaved scalp, and the dead eyes of someone who'd served on Tertius too long to remember anything else. She reviewed my performance records, all exemplary, all perfect, all indicating a model worker, and then looked at me with something almost like pity. "You're adapting too well," she said, and the words hung between us heavy with meaning. The fortress values efficiency, but the Imperium values humanity. You're approaching the threshold where you stop being a useful crew member and become a something else. We have protocols for this. You'll be transferred to deep station duties, areas where your efficiency can be utilized without disturbing the newer crew. It's not a punishment. It's recognition that you've given everything to your service. The Emperor knows your sacrifice. I understood immediately what she meant. Deep station duties, areas the newer crew never saw. I was being segregated, set aside, stored in the fortress's depths, like a tool that still functioned but had become disturbing to use. The deep station was perfect silence. The hum was absolute here, not a sound but a presence, a pressure that filled everything, that made normal human senses irrelevant because the hum contained all information, all awareness, all necessary understanding. The sections I was assigned to weren't decorated with Imperial architecture, they were pure Blackstone, vast corridors and chambers carved with patterns that looked organic and mathematical simultaneously, surfaces that glowed faintly with internal light, spaces that existed in configurations three-dimensional physics shouldn't allow. There were others here, perhaps 100 of us, all working in perfect coordination without communication, all moving through the space like blood through veins, all serving functions we understood instinctively. We maintained systems that kept the fortress operational, not the life support or weapons or shields that the surface crew managed, but deeper functions, foundational operations, things that might have been power generation or structural integrity or quantum stabilization. Processes that had no names in Imperial technical language because Imperial science hadn't discovered them yet. I can't tell you how long I've been in Deep Station now. Time functions differently here, or perhaps my perception of time has simply dissolved into the constant present the fortress exists in. I know intellectually that years must be passing. I receive no nutrition, no water, no sleep, yet I continue functioning, which suggests either time dilation or that my body has been altered in ways I can't perceive. I see other Deep Station workers sometimes, recognize faces from my early service, people who were listed as disappeared or psychologically discharged, but who are still here, still serving, still maintained by the fortress. Because we're useful, because we're compatible, because we've become whatever the fortress needs us to be. We don't acknowledge each other. Recognition would imply separation, individuality, and we're beyond that now. We're components. We're extensions. We're the nervous system of something vast and ancient and utterly alien that humanity has claimed without understanding, that we've declared holy and sanctified without comprehending what holiness means to an entity that predates our species. Sometimes I remember who I was. The memories come like signals from a distant station, faint and distorted, carrying information about a person named something I can't quite recall, who believed in the Emperor and wanted to serve and thought meaning came through duty and sacrifice. That person seems naive now, seems to have operated under such limited perception, seeing only the narrow spectrum human senses allow, believing only what Imperial doctrine permitted. I know more now. I understand the fortress isn't alive in ways human consciousness is alive. It's something else. Something that exists across dimensions we can barely perceive, something that uses matter and energy as casually as we use tools, something that's been observing humanity since we first crawled out of old Earth's gravity well and found it floating in the void, already ancient, already waiting. The Imperium thinks it controls the Blackstone Fortresses, thinks faith and blood have sanctified them, thinks they're weapons in humanity's arsenal. But we don't control them any more than bacteria control the human body they inhabit. We're permitted to use certain functions because permitting us serves whatever purposes these structures have, purposes we can't comprehend with consciousness that only processes three spatial dimensions and linear time. This should terrify me. The person I was would have been horrified, would have screamed heresy, would have demanded inquisitorial investigation and imperial rejection of these structures no matter their tactical value. But I'm beyond horror now, beyond fear, beyond any emotion except a vast calm that comes from understanding my insignificance, my proper place in hierarchies that dwarf human concerns. The Imperium will continue using the Blackstone Fortresses because it has no choice. They're too valuable, too powerful, too necessary in humanity's endless wars against extinction. Crews will continue serving on them, adapting or breaking or disappearing, generation after generation, slowly being shaped into something compatible with architecture that shouldn't exist. Some will serve on the surface, maintaining life support and weapons, believing they're doing holy work, never understanding what they're actually part of. Some will descend to Deep Station like I did, will cross whatever threshold transforms crew into component, will join the 100 or 1,000 or million of us who maintain the fortress's true functions in spaces human consciousness can barely process. And the fortresses will continue floating in the void, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to the tiny lives crawling through them, permitting us our illusions of control because our presence serves some purpose we'll never comprehend. I still hear the hum. It's everything now, all sound, all meaning, all communication. It tells me what needs maintenance, what systems require adjustment, what parts of the fortress are preparing for weapons discharge or defensive configuration or warp translation. I respond automatically, moving through spaces that shift and reconfigure around me, using tools that might be my own hands or might be extensions the fortress provides, maintaining operations that keep 30,000 surface crew alive and functional. The surface crew rotates every few years, on average new arrivals replacing those who break or disappear, fresh minds not yet adapted, still human enough to perform human tasks. But we deep station workers continue. Permanent installations, no longer subject to time or exhaustion or doubt. We are what happens when you work on a Blackstone Fortress long enough, when you serve faithfully enough, when you open yourself completely to duty without protecting any core of self. We are the grim reality beneath the glory. The price paid for wielding weapons we don't understand, the inevitable outcome of humanity's desperate reliance on technology that predates our species and will outlast our extinction. If you're reading this somehow, if some fragment of my journal survived, if you're serving on a Blackstone station and starting to notice the hum, starting to feel the fortress awareness, starting to understand that the architecture shifts when you're not watching, know that what you're experiencing is real. Know that you're not going insane. Or rather, that the insanity is built into the structure, required for service, necessary for the Imperium's survival. Know that you have perhaps 4 years before you cross the threshold beyond which return becomes impossible. 4 years to decide if you want to request psychological discharge, to claim instability, to escape while escape remains possible. But also know that escape is probably illusion, that once you've been exposed to the Blackstone frequency you carry it with you wherever you go, that the fortress has already marked you, claimed you, begun the process of transformation whether you remain or flee. This is the price of serving on humanity's greatest weapons. This is what the Imperium won't acknowledge but tacitly accepts, because it has no alternative. This is the grim reality of working on a Blackstone Fortress, not glory, not honor, not heroic service, but slow dissolution of self, gradual transformation into component parts of something vast and alien and utterly beyond human comprehension. The hum continues. The work continues. The fortress continues, floating in the void, eternal and patient and vast. And I continue with it. No longer crew member or human or individual, just awareness serving function. Consciousness, distributed through ancient architecture, one small part of something that was old when humanity was young and will remain long after the last human voice falls silent. This is not tragedy. This is not horror. This is simply what is, what must be, what the Imperium requires even as it denies the reality of that requirement. Serve well. Adapt quickly. Try not to understand too much, and maybe, if you're fortunate, you'll break within the first few years. Be discharged for psychological instability, escape before the transformation completes. But probably not. Probably you'll endure, as we all endured, as the fortress requires, as duty demands. Probably you'll descend eventually to deep station, to the silence that's actually absolute noise, to spaces where human consciousness dissolves into something larger and less defined. Probably you'll join us here in the depths, maintaining operations you can't name, serving purposes you can't comprehend, existing in the vast calm that comes from surrendering completely to necessity. The Emperor protects. We say this constantly, ritual phrase worn smooth by repetition, but on the Blackstone fortresses, it's the fortress that protects, the fortress that provides, the fortress that determines who serves and who breaks and who transforms. The Emperor is distant, silent, maybe dead, maybe a corpse maintained by machinery and faith. But the fortress is immediate, present, absolutely real. More God than the God Emperor could ever be, because it doesn't require belief, only proximity, only exposure, only time. Serve long enough and you'll understand. Serve long enough and understanding will be the last thing you lose, replaced by something purer, simpler, more true. Serve long enough, and you'll become like us. The deep station workers, the transformed ones, the grim reality beneath the glory that keeps the Imperium's greatest weapons functional across millennia despite their incomprehensibility. The hum tells me something needs maintenance 3 sections forward. Port side, lower access corridor. I move to address it, flowing through passages that reconfigure around my presence, using senses that aren't sight or hearing, performing tasks that aren't repair but something more fundamental. Other workers pass me, their faces blank, their movements precise, all of us coordinated through connection to the fortress awareness. Somewhere far above, in the surface sections, new crew members are arriving, young and faithful and eager, beginning their service, not yet understanding what they've joined. They'll learn, they'll adapt or break or disappear. Some small number will descend eventually to join us here. We'll cross the threshold. We'll complete the transformation, and the fortress will continue, patient and vast, maintaining itself through our labor, permitting humanity to believe it's in control, serving purposes we can't comprehend in a universe that doesn't care about human survival. This is the grim reality. This is the truth they don't tell you in the recruitment centers or the Shola teachings or the imperial propaganda. This is what it means to work on a Blackstone Fortress. Not glory, not honor, not heroic service defending humanity from Xenos threat. Just slow absorption into something ancient and alien, just gradual dissolution of self, just transformation from individual consciousness into distributed component of a structure that uses humanity as carelessly as we use tools, that maintains us because we're useful, and discards us when we're not. We are crew. We are workers. We are maintenance organisms crawling through the passages of something that was ancient when the Emperor was born. And we continue. Forever, because the Imperium needs these weapons, and the price of using them is us, our minds, ourselves. Our humanity fed gradually into ancient machinery that doesn't care what we were, only what we become. The hum continues. Always. Forever. Perfect, and absolute, and inescapable. And I continue with it, having long ago forgotten what silence felt like, what it meant to be separate from the structure that contains me, what I was before I became this. The person who wrote that journal in cipher is gone. The apprentice engineer who arrived faithful and eager is gone. Even the worker who descended to deep station with some final shred of human consciousness intact is gone. What remains is function. What remains is purpose. What remains is service to something vast and unknowable that humanity has claimed without comprehending, that we've sanctified without understanding, that we'll continue serving until either we're gone or it decides we're no longer necessary. This is the grim reality. This is the truth. This is what working on a Blackstone Fortress ultimately means, becoming part of it, merging with it, losing everything you were to become whatever it needs you to be. And the fortress hums on, eternal and patient, carrying its crew through the void, maintaining operations through us, using us, consuming us, never stopping, never changing, never caring that we existed, or that we've ceased to exist, or that the distinction between those states no longer means anything. We are the Blackstone Fortress. We serve. We continue. Forever.